Next up, we're joined by our literary critic Barry Welsh for our weekly segment Korea Book Club. Here we delve into the world of Korean literature through works available in translation and beyond. So, Barry, hello. It's great to see you. Hope you've been well.
Yes, very well. Good to see you again.
Okay, so what book are you introducing to our listeners today?
Well, this evening we're reviewing a short story called Raptors Upstream by Hwang Jungeun and translated by Agnel Joseph. The Korean title is 상류엔맹금류, and it was originally published in Korean in 2013, the fall issue of a literary magazine called 차음과 모음, or Consonants and Vowels in English, and then it was included in a collection of Hwang's stories called Being Nobody in 2016. But this English translation was published as part of the 10th anniversary edition of the Korean Literature Now magazine, which we've dipped into several times. And the translator of today's story, Agnel Joseph, is also the editor-in-chief of Korean Literature Now. And you can, of course, subscribe to the magazine and access most of its content for free on its website. And it's an incredible resource for anyone who's interested in Korean literature. Today's writer, Hwang Jungeun, is someone we've covered before. We reviewed both of her novels that have been translated into English, 100 Shadows and I'll Go On. And we praised both of those stories for their very sort of sensitive and insightful depictions of people who've been marginalised in different ways. In today's story, Raptors Upstream, we find Hwang in very similar territory. She's writing about an underprivileged family and their life trials.
Right, so as you said, we've talked about her before. Hwang is a writer with a significant following, especially among millennial readers. Her early short stories, and especially her debut novel, 100 Shadows, endeared her to readers of this generation. In fact, she was sometimes called a spokesperson for the Hell Joseon generation, a term that was popular around the early 2010s. She also built a following with 2 successful book podcasts, cementing her reputation as a thoughtful critic and fan as well as creator. So with all that in mind then, tell us more about this work today, Barry. What is Hwang focusing on in Raptors Upstream?
Right, so this is a story of a family's misfortune, and it's told from the perspective of an outsider to the family. We have an unnamed narrator, a young woman, who relates a story about her relationship and a trip she went on with her ex-boyfriend, Jae-hee, and his family. And we learn that Jae-hee's family had, at one point, they were relatively well-off and successful merchants with a comfortable, let's say just a generally happy, comfortable middle-class lifestyle. They ran a fruit business, and they were generally content and happy with their place on the social ladder. However, they're conned by an acquaintance who steals a significant sum of money from them, and who it also turns out had built up quite substantial debts using Jae-hee's family name. And as such, the family is placed in a very difficult quandary. What do they do now? The thief proves impossible to track down. They can't trace this person, so there's no option of justice in that direction. Jae-hee's parents contemplate the unthinkable, killing themselves and their young children, but of course they decide against this path. So what then? What options are available to them? Jae-hee's father wants to put the children up for adoption, but his mother refuses. So they decide the only option they have is to buckle down and try and pay off this, massive, overwhelming debt they've been unfairly burdened with. And Hwang writes that Jae-hee's family never recovered from this fall. And over the rest of the story, she shows how their lives changed and why they possibly made the wrong decision.
Yes, this story is particularly haunting as there have been some incidents which have made headlines in the last year or so in Korea of families falling into financial hardship and doing the unthinkable you mentioned earlier, killing themselves and their children. But as you said, this story was published in 2013, so long before these incidents. But it shows how this has been a persistent issue for a long time in Korea. We've seen instances of fictional stories in TV and film as well, such as Squid Game and Parasite, that show families and individuals resorting to desperate measures to climb out of poverty, financial hardship, and improve their circumstances. So this is a theme, sadly, which has been touched upon in many areas. How does Hwang then tackle these issues, and what does she have to say about inequality?
Right. So you could imagine in the hands of another writer, this would become, a more simple morality tale. You have a good family who makes a mistake in their judgment, and they see their position in society crumble as their neighbours, whom they've considered friends, turn on them and expel them from their midst, from where they'd previously been very welcome. And that is what happens in the story. So Jaehee's family, they have to sell their shop, they have to move into a much smaller and very cramped apartment. They take the eldest daughter out of school, and she has to get a job. They start marrying off the younger sisters. But despite all of these efforts, getting out from under this debt is almost impossible. And they become old with this debt as yet, fully unpaid. The debt's still there. The daughters, even though the family, marries them off, they never get to attend university and essentially marry into, similarly impoverished circumstances. You sort of comment on perhaps how difficult it is to marry your way up the social ladder. And the narrator wonders, at what price did their proud stance of paying back the debt come? So she says, I thought it was immoral. She wonders, why didn't they run away, start somewhere new, start somewhere else instead of condemning their children to the lives they now lead? And Jaehee's family has done what we might call the honourable thing. We would think this was the honourable and fair path to follow, perhaps. But we're also led to question, in a society so unfair, so stacked against those with debts and low incomes, can we really consider this sort of supposed noble path to be the moral or correct choice?
Indeed, it's a very difficult question. On one hand, we might generally think that, of course, we should pay our debts, but at the same time, if the terms of the debt are so extreme for the one paying, can this really be called just in any way? Is it possible to break out of this sort of cycle? So how does Hwang develop this idea then? What are your final takeaways from it, Barry?
Right, so on the surface, Raptors Upstream, it's a deceptively simple story, but I think it has, sort of subtleties and layers that you might miss. It's actually very layered and thorny and quite a difficult story. You could see a more simplistic version of the story where, the family takes on this unfair debt, they work hard, and eventually pay it off, and they're restored to their former position in the pecking order. That could almost like a Dickens story or a Victorian novel or something about someone escaping the poorhouse or the debtor's prison. But that isn't the case here. The family does work hard for many years to fulfill this obligation. But Hwang just calmly shows us how this burden crushes their spirit, it ruins their inter-family relationships, and that there's no real honour or pride to be taken in shouldering the burden of a cruel debt that you can't realistically be expected to pay. Instead, your family will suffer, your relationships will suffer, and so on. And there's an excellent essay by a literary critic called Hwang Jungeun about the story, in which they write, their self-pride fails to save them, and instead they end up imprisoning themselves within an endless orbit that saps their life little by little. Ultimately, their honourable decisions only amount to attachment to conventional morals. So it's really a very complicated story, poses some very challenging questions, and like you mentioned, it's also a story that connects to wider issues in Korea and elsewhere as well.
Yes, it sounds like quite a powerful commentary on this aspect of Korean society, I guess. The trap of poverty, or at least the trap of being able to, being being unable to free oneself from living a life where you're constantly under financial pressure. It sounds like a work that will indeed speak to a lot of people. It's called Raptors Upstream by Hwang Jungeun, and that was our pick for Korea Book Club this week. Barry, thank you for bringing us that work to look at, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.
Okay, take care.